Hey everyone, welcome back to another video from A Man Talks NRL SuperCoach. In today's video, I'm going to be taking you through the players that I think are the best options to be putting into your hooker position. Let's get into it. So the way that I'm going to kind of separate out this video is I'm going to be taking you through 3 different price tiers. So I'll be taking through the more premium gun options who are over the 500k mark, the mid-rangers who are between the 300 to 500, and then all the cheapies who come under that, and the potential cash cow options that we want to have at this, in our team to start the season. So I've got here the 5 best options that I think you can have in the gun category. Unfortunately, Cam McInnes has done his ACL injury, and I'd already done up the video before that announcement was released. So unfortunately, he's just not going to be an option for us. So it's 4 options, sorry, not 5. But yeah, it's really unfortunate because he's super consistent, and he probably was going to be my first choice hooker option. But obviously, we just can't have him as a consideration for this season. So the 4 others I think would be Harry Grant, Damien Cook, Koroisau, and Tevaga. And I think, in my opinion, it's really important to get at least one of these guys to start your team, because I think they're just going to be the most consistent hooker options, the most highest scoring hooker options. And I think hooker is a position where you really always want to be having at least one gun player to start the year. So I'll start off with Harry Grant. So he's coming in about 630k. Obviously now he's moved back to the Storm, so you'd expect, he's now surrounded with players like Munster and Pappenhausen, so you can expect potentially his attacking points to increase while having a good base, floor already. So you can see there the stats that I've got up in that table. He was averaging a PPM of almost about 1 point per minute, which is really good to see, given that he's on average going to be playing maybe in the 70 to 80 minute mark. Now again, that is all dependent, I guess, on what kind of rotation gets used at the Storm with him and Brandon Smith. And we don't even know yet about Cam Smith, what's happening with him, but we're just going to assume that, Harry Grant is going to be the first choice, number 9. And if he is, even if he was playing 65 minutes, I think that would still give you a good floor of about 65 points. And you can see there, he's averaging about 67 of his points from base stats, which actually means that he's got about 20 to 25% of his points actually coming from attacking threat, from try assists, line break assists, scoring tries himself, offloads, tackle breaks, that kind of thing. So I think when he's actually playing in a more successful Melbourne team than, say, in the Tigers, I actually think that attacking potential is, it's obviously going to be increased. You'd expect the Storm to be scoring more points than the Tigers. Now, the Storm do have a bit of a tough start to the year. I can't quite remember the teams, but they've had some tough games in their first 6-game stretch. I did do a video going through the teams that I think had the good and the tough starts of the year. So if you guys haven't checked that out already, would highly recommend to do that. But I think given that he's got a good variety of ways to get his points, I think he's a really, really solid option. And with the McInnes news, I think he's probably going to be my next best replacement at the hooker position. Moving on to Damien Cook, I think it's not as surprising to see that the ownership stats of these two are going to be the highest in the hooker role, given McInnes' injury. I think these two are going to be the most consistent options that you can rely on. So Damien Cook's about 10k cheaper at 620, averaging points, very, very similar to Harry Grant. With PPM a bit lower at 0.88. Now, the one thing I do find with Cook is obviously, he's averaging about the same percentage of his points from base stats, similar to Harry Grant. But the one thing I do find with Cook is that he was a little bit more inconsistent than Harry Grant. I think I remember last season his highest points was like 138, but his lowest was 38. Whereas I think with Grant, in games that he was playing more than, like, say, 40 minutes, I think his lowest was like 48. So Grant just had a little bit of a higher floor than Damien Cook. And the Rabbitohs do also have a pretty tough start to the season as well. Their first 3-game stretch, I think they've got the Storm and the Roosters. But then I think they do have a pretty soft part of the draw from rounds 4 and 5, when I think they've got the Bulldogs and the Broncos. So with Cook, he obviously, you'd expect him to be getting points from his, from his tackles and his run meters. But he can chip in, with some attacking threat as well from tries and line breaks. So I think, he's going to be a good option to have if you think that the Rabbitohs are going to have a good start to the year as well. I think for me personally, it'll be between Harry Grant and Damien Cook for me in the hooker role. I think the one thing that Damien Cook might have over Grant is that he's, you can rely on him playing 80 minutes a game. He's the first choice hooker. There's no one really that's going to take him out of the rotation. Whereas with Grant, there's I guess it's a little bit of a risk with Brandon Smith, potentially spending some time at number 9 as well. So I think that is the one potential risk with Harry Grant. Of the two, I would probably lean towards Grant just because I think his attacking upside is greater and he's a little bit more consistent in my opinion. So I think that makes him a little bit more of a safer potential captain or vice captain option as well, which is something we have to consider. So moving on to Koroisau, I think Koroisau is actually someone who's gone a little bit under the radar this year. Obviously he was super popular last year, mainly because he was starting out pretty cheap in the 300k. And it was pretty guaranteed that he was going to be the starting number 9, which he will be again this year. But obviously with his price increased to about 590k, it becomes a little bit less appealing compared to last year. But I think he's actually one option that I have really been considering as a potential differential. At the time when I pulled this together, he was only owned by about 11% of the game. And I think the Panthers have a really good start to the season in terms of difficulty of opponents. So I think he can chip in there with some attacking points. I think that's not quite his game, as you can see there. His base percentage is 76%, so he really relies on base stats to be getting his points, just from tackles and run meters, and less so with the try contributions and attacking points. But with a PPM comparable to Damien Cook, I think actually you could argue potentially that Koroisau and Cook are closer in quality, I guess, as an option, based on that PPM being very similar. His minutes per game, he did have a spell during the season last year, I think, where he was having some injury problems, so he was quite often being rested, or his minutes were being managed, which is good for his health. But for us in SuperCoach, we want guys who are going to be playing the 80 minutes, so we can get the most points we can out of them. So I think he's a good option to consider. If you want to go the point of difference route, I think he's a really good option to consider. Personally, I've been toying with the idea, but I think I'm going to be leaning towards Grant and Cook. I think they've just got a little bit more upside than at Koroisau. And then finally I've got Tevaga. So I have asterisks in there because he does have hooker / second row forward dual flexibility, which is actually something I think is it's obviously an advantage for him. That really helps having dual position players in your team. At 550k, he's only owned by 3% at the time that I pulled this together. And obviously with McInnes's injury, I would expect that to go up a little. But I can confidently say that his ownership would be less than the other 3 that I've mentioned before. And the thing with him, he's just an absolute workhorse. You can see that PPM. He was averaging 1.3 points per minute when he was on the field. He just loved to get into it, get into tackles. And the thing with Tevaga as well, that his base percentage is 76%. But the way he gets his other points is from offloads. He loves to offload. I think he only scored maybe 1 try last year. But he just loves to get offloads, which is great to see when you're watching games and you see him popping offloads and you're like, yep, more points for me. The only downside with him is his minutes. We just don't know what kind of minutes he's going to get under the new coach at the Warriors. But in 47 minutes, getting an average of 62 points, that's really impressive. So I think if you knew who were getting about 55 to 60 minutes from Tevaga, I think he'd be a really good option. And you have that flexibility. You don't have to put him in your hooker position. You can actually just chuck him into your second row as well. There is definitely room for him in your team. Maybe not in the hooker position, but if you want to get him into your second row, I think it's pretty valid. Now I'm just going to jump onto a bit of a player comparison as well. So this is just kind of a compilation of their stats from last year as well. A lot of the things you'll see are very similar. But one thing I wanted to point out as well was the min and max score, just in the middle of that table there. So you can see, kind of alluding to before, Harry Grant, his minimum score was 40 points and his max was 100, which, so he only had a variance of 60 points between his minimum and his maximum. And you can see that 40-point game actually came when he was only playing 56 minutes. So, in all the other games where he was playing kind of like 80 minutes to, 60 plus minutes, he was really consistent. He did have that one 48-point game, but, we'll let him off the hook for just one game in the season, I think. So I think Harry Grant, he'll be super consistent. With Cook there, you can see in the second column, again, he had that variance of 35 points to 138. And that's kind of something to maybe just keep in mind when you're selecting Cook, is that the variance can really be there. But, if you're a player who really likes to have players with big upside, I think Cook could be your man. Because you can see here, obviously, he was playing 80 minutes a game. He scored 35 in an 80-minute game, and at the same time, he scored 138. So the variance was huge. And with Koroisau, you can see here the minutes did kind of start to tail off in the second half of the season, which probably did, affect his average as well. Because you can see to start the year, he was getting into the 70s quite consistently as well. So I think he was just a really reliable option. So I think if you're looking to maybe save some money in the hooker position, because he's a little bit cheaper than Grant and Cook, I think if you think that he's going to be playing close to 80 minutes, I think he's going to be a safe option. And kind of what I was talking about with Tevaga, you can see there, his minutes were just kind of all over the place. Like, we were kind of seeing it start to increase after 4 or 5 games, but then it went back down to the 30s and the 40s, so it was just kind of just all over the place. But I think what you can expect from him is that, when he's on the field, he's going to be getting you points. So I think it's kind of depends on what kind of, flavor of hooker, you would prefer. That sounded really bad. But yeah, so those are the gun players that I think you can consider in hooker. Personally, for me, I would go either Grant or Cook. But I think if you're looking for a little bit of a difference option that will save you money in that position, Koroisau and Tevaga, I think, are safe bets. Alright, so moving on to the kind of mid-range hooker options. I've got 3 options here, and to be honest though, I'll present the options to you, but I think for me, I'm not really going to go for any of these 3. I think for hooker roles, given the potential cash cow options we have in that position, I think I'm going to be going with a gun option and then a cheapie. I just don't see room for myself to have a mid-range option, but I know some players, will play the game differently, so I thought still worthwhile for me to give you guys some considerations. So starting off, I had Brandon Smith at 490k. Again, kind of the same point that I mentioned with Grant. We just don't quite know yet what his role is going to be. You'd expect him either to be maybe in the 13 or otherwise in that kind of number 14 role off the bench. But as a result, looking at his minutes, we're not quite sure, what kind of minutes he's going to play. He does have a good PPM at over 1 points per minute. So that when he's on the field, he is a workhorse. He loves to get into it. And you can see with him, there's 72% of his points are from base. I think you're really expecting just kind of the points to come from a work rate. You might expect to see an occasional attacking return, potentially some offloads as well in his game. But I think for me, the price is a little bit too much for me for what you're going to get back as well. And I'm just not sure about what his role is going to be. So for me, I just don't want to really have that kind of, just have that in the back of my mind when I've got him in my team, how many minutes he's going to play. So I think for me, he's just not going to be in my side personally. But I know towards the back end of the year, he did become a popular option when Grant actually got injured, because then that meant, we were looking for different hooker options. And I think Smith at the time was also injured, and Koroisau was having a bit of his troubles as well. So I think that's when Smith kind of was getting into consideration. He does have dual flexibility as well. He is a hooker / second row. So, if you really value that could, come into favor. Obviously you could just put him in your second row and not use up a hooker slot. But even in second row, I don't know if I'd go for him there. Next up, I've got Josh Hodgson, 370k. He was owned by about 8% of the game at the time that I pulled this together. Again, for me, I think he's just not going to be an option. Like, he's just one of those guys who's really, really good in real life, NRL. But when it comes to SuperCoach, he's just not that kind of player that we want. His PPM, obviously, again, this is kind of taken into consideration his last year, which was injury affected. So I think that's something to consider as well, that his PPM might not be entirely accurate. But I think what's good to note there is that, 80% of his points are from base. And even when he was averaging 75 minutes a game, he was only averaging about 42 points. So I think you're only really going to expect points from him to be coming from just the tackles and the work rate. He does chip in obviously with the attacking threat, and I guess you could say with the Raiders, they've got a lot of key players like himself back. You could expect them to be maybe scoring more points, and so for him to be more involved. So you could make that argument, but I think for me, again, as I mentioned, I'm not really too appealed by the mid-range options at hooker. I think you've got better options than the cash cows and in the guns. So it's just kind of hard for me to justify having him in my team. But I know a lot of people would like him as the player, and would, obviously he's got a higher ownership than the other 2 that I've mentioned here, and I think that's a lot of it just because people will see him and they know that he's a good player in real life, so they think it will translate to SuperCoach. But I would just maybe quell your expectations in that regard. And moving on to Jayden Brailey, so he's about 356k. He's, at the time that I pulled this together, was owned by about 7% of the game. And so I think actually that's probably a good indicator about that all these guys are in the single-digit percentage ownership. So I think that tells you that most players don't usually go for this kind of price bracket of hooker, because normally they're either going for the cheapies or they're going for the guns. So that is something to keep in the back of your mind. But he is expected to be the starting number 9 at the Knights, with Kurt Mann, I think, moving back to 5'8". And so I don't actually know who would be the backup hooker. Potentially Connor Watson, I think, could maybe fill into that role at times. But I think you'd expect Jayden Brailey to be playing 80 minutes. And again, not too surprising that, 79% of his points would be coming from base stats. PPM at 0.72 just doesn't really look that appealing to me. I think comparing that to the guys of Harry Grant, Damien Cook, whose PPMs are getting close to like the 0.9, the 1.0, I think you really want to be seeing a good PPM. So I think, he was averaging 49 points, but I think at 350k again, it's just one of those things. It's a bit of an awkward price. So for me, I'm just not sure I'm going to go there. But, I think given that he does have that starting number 9 role, the Knights do have a good start to the season in terms of, difficulty of opponents. So, if you think he's maybe got some attacking potential to crash over for a dummy half try or something like that, you can maybe take a punt on him. But personally for me, I just don't think I'm going to go there. And finally, we're moving on to the cheapies. I think this is what everyone's been waiting for. We all want to know about the cash cows, right? So the 3 cash cow cheapie options that I think I've got for you in the hookers are Connor Watson, Jacob Liddle, and Jake Simpkin. So I think Connor Watson, at 288k, owned by about 17% of the game at the time that I put this together, I think is a really, really good option. I think he's got a good PPM there, as you can see there, of 1.2, which I think is a really good indicator because it shows you that even if he has a role from the bench, in those 46 minutes, if he's averaging about 36 points, he's still going to be able to bring, deliver some points. And I think he's expected to either be in the number 13 role or in that kind of bench utility role as well. But I think, at the price, it's easier to justify than, say, those mid-range player options. It's easier to fit him in under the budget. And I think if you expect that his minutes will go up, if he does potentially lock down a role in this starting second row, I think he'll be a great cash cow option. And he also has an advantage of being listed in 5'8 as well. So having that dual flexibility does come in handy. If you get, say, an injury to one of those two positions, you can, swap him around and then be able to replace that injured player. So that really does come in handy when it comes to trading players down the line. So I think Connor Watson, I think, is going to be a safe bet. We'll see, I guess, as well, like the round 1 team list. If he is listed at number 13, I think he'll be in my team for sure. Even if he's a number 14, I think, given the price is so low, I think it's a safe bet to go with him. Now, finally, the 2 other cheapies are both the Tigers hookers who will be replacing Harry Grant. So Jacob Liddle and Jake Simpkin. I think there's been a lot of talk about these two in the SuperCoach community because, which one do we go for? Because obviously they're both cheap, but, Simpkin is obviously, 70k cheaper than Liddle, and any money that we can save at the start to put into other positions I think is always valuable when we're starting a year. So you can see both these guys are already owned by about 28% and 10% respectively. Liddle, we have a little bit more stats on him, given that when Harry Grant was off the pitch at points during last season, Liddle was the one to fill in. And you can see here, and those, he was only averaging about 22 minutes a game. This is actually, that's 2019 stats I pulled together. With a PPM just over 1. So I think that's a good indicator, obviously, of his work rate. Again, a base percentage of about 79% is not surprising to me. The hookers will mainly get their points from just their tackling and their hit-ups. So that really doesn't surprise me. But, he's priced at an average of 31. So I think even if he plays like 40 to, 50 minutes in a game, at a PPM of a 1, if he's getting about 40 to 50 points, he's going to be averaging above his price, so he'll be making some money. So I think he's going to be a safe bet as well. And then moving on to Simpkin, I think he's priced obviously at bottom price in the game. So if he gets any points, he'll be able to make us some money. And I don't know quite what the rotation is going to be between the two. But say, for example, if Liddle played 50 to 60 minutes and Simpkin played 20 minutes, I think Simpkin could maybe then average 20 points. So I guess it kind of depends what you go for. Do you really want to save money with Simpkin? Or do you want to have a little bit maybe more security with Liddle that he's going to be playing more minutes at the Tigers in the number 9 spot? So I think personally for me, I've got Liddle at the moment in my bench hooker position, and I've actually got Connor Watson in my 5'8 one. So I think all 3 of these are really, really valid cash cow options. That's kind of how I've thought about it. I think I'd want maybe a little bit more security of Liddle having, playing more minutes. So I've got him in the hooker slot, and then Connor Watson I really wanted. I think he's going to be a good option. So I had him down at my 5'8, and that's how I've kind of fit in the 2 players there. But I think with any of these 3, you can't really go wrong given their price tag. Alright guys, well that's the end of the video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that and got some value out of that. I think this is kind of the stuff that I'm hoping most people want to see in terms of the actual players to put into your team. But I did have previous videos talking about the difficulty of draw for the first 6 rounds for every team. So do check that out if you're interested in that. But yeah, hopefully you guys found value out of that. You know, give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and do subscribe, because I'm going to be doing similar videos for every position moving forward before the season starts. But I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.